Plato's contribution to literary criticism. Plato was admired by lovers of literary art because Plato wrote dramatic dialogues rather than didactic treatises. It could be expected that a great philosopher like him would place a high value on literary art, but he attacked poetry along with other forms of what he called mimesis. According to Plato's theory of mimesis, imitation, the arts deal with illusion, and they are imitation of an imitation. Thus, they are twice removed from reality. As a moralist, he objects to it because it is immoral. As a philosopher, he disapproves of it because it is based in falsehood. He is of the view that truth of philosophy, which deals with ideas, is more important than the pleasure of poetry, which deals with ideas. He is of the view that truth of philosophy, which deals with ideas, is more important than the pleasures of poetry, which is based in falsehood. He agreed that most of it should be banned from the ideal society that he described in his Republic. Aristotle's contribution to literary criticism. Critical theory long existed before literary criticism of individual works. The earliest work of theory was Aristotle's Poetics, which, in spite of its name, is not only a discussion of poetry, but it is about the nature of literature itself. In the Poetics, Aristotle gives us his famous definition of tragedy and insists that literature is about character and that character is rooted through action. He tries to identify the required stages in the progress of a plot. He was also the first writer to develop a reader-centered approach to literature. This is proved by the way he tries to describe how drama affects the audience. According to him, tragedy should simulate the emotions of pity and fear, these being roughly sympathy for and empathy with the misfortunes of the protagonist. By the combination of these emotions comes catharsis, as the audience identifies with the tragedy of the central character. Aristotle identifies three key elements in a plot: hamartia, anagnorisis, peripeteia. Hamartia means sin or fault. This is the tragic flaw in the character of the protagonist. Anagnorisis means recognition or realization, this being a moment in the narrative when the truth of the situation is recognized by the protagonist. Often it's a moment of self-recognition. Peripeteia means a turnaround or reversal of fortune. In classical tragedy, this is usually a fall from high to low estate, as the hero falls from greatness to miserable depths. While identifying his three key moments, Aristotle took examples from the Greek tragedies of his time. Plato and Aristotle's contributions, there are a lot of differences as well as some similarities, and some of them have been discussed here. While discussing the contributions to literary criticism by two major figures of antiquity, we may also examine their differences. Plato's theory of mimesis. Plato, in his theory of mimesis, declares that all art is mimetic by nature. He believes that idea is the ultimate reality. Since art imitates idea, it is the imitation of reality. Example, when a carpenter wants to build a chair, he first thinks of the chair, what it should look like. And then he builds one from it, from his idea. Now that is one imitation. When a painter is painting that same chair, he is imitating it again, and so his art is twice removed from the reality. This is why Plato considered philosophy to be superior to poetry, because as art, poetry is also twice removed from reality. He rejected poetry because it is mimetic in nature on moral and philosophical grounds. Aristotle, however, supported poetry because of its mimetic nature. According to Aristotle, poetry is the imitation of an action. And his tool of inquiry is neither moral nor philosophical, for he examines poetry as a piece of art and not as a moral treatise to be used for teaching or preaching. Aristotle's reply to Plato's objection to art in general and poetry in particular are discussed here. Plato's theory is that art, being imitation of the actual, is removed from truth. Art gives only the likeness, the image of truth, and this is less than the real. What Plato does not seem to take into account is that great art is never a carbon copy imitation of reality. Art gives something extra which is not there in reality. For example, literature is not the exact reproduction of life in all its aspects. The artist makes judicious selection of events or characters which would best suit his purpose. He may even idealize and imaginatively recreate a world which has its own meaning and its own beauty. All this would not be present in the actual reality. This means that the poet's imitation is the actual plus something more, which according to Aristotle does not take us away from truth. On the contrary, it leads us to the essential reality of life. According to Plato, art is bad because it doesn't inspire virtue or teach morality. But why should art be didactic? Its function is to provide aesthetic delight, communicate experience, express emotions, and represent life. It is a function of ethics to teach morality, not arts. As Scott James observes, morality teaches. Art does not attempt to teach. It merely asserts that it is thus and thus, that life is perceived to be. That is my bit of reality, says the artist. Take it or leave it. Draw any lessons you like from it. That is my account of things as they are. If it has any value to you as evidence of teaching, use it, but that is not my business. Another charge that Plato made against art was that art numbed the faculty of reason, and for encouraging the weakest part of the human soul by its needless lamentations or ecstasies of happiness. Aristotle, in his theory of catharsis, refuted these charges. According to him, tragedy, that is art, gives new knowledge, yields aesthetic satisfaction, and produces a better state of mind. To conclude, Plato judged poetry from an educational standpoint, then the philosophical, and finally from the ethical one, but did not consider it from its own unique standpoint. He failed to define poetry's aims and objectives, and did not consider the fact that art has its own criteria of merit and demerit. Poetry, ethics, philosophy, none of these have identical functions. So, to reject poetry because it is not philosophy or ethics does seem to be absurd.